How is this film not talked about more? Admittedly, this wasn't a thorough search, but looking on YouTube, I only found one other video essay about this film. Red Beard is the 1965 masterpiece from the iconic, one of the most influential directors of all time, Akira Kurosawa, and yet there's only one video essay about it. I'm going to try and give a fairly comprehensive summary of the film because I'm assuming off the back of this lack of content about it that most of you haven't seen the film, possibly haven't even heard of it, as I had not until it was recommended to me by fellow YouTuber and video essayist Arttective. Check out his channel if you don't know it, by the way. I found him when I was still on about 300 subscribers myself and loved his videos on Spirited Away, Gladiator, and an incredibly unique one about Mr. Bean that I even made a community post about back in the day. I've been blessed with the unexpected luck in the algorithm, and I feel he deserves that same luck too, because his videos are great, and he suggested talking about Red Beard, and now here we are making a collaboration video about it.
Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it. I believe by virtue of being a counselor and the fact that Joe made several wonderful videos dissecting the personalities of characters from films like Good Will Hunting, Dead Poets Society, and The Breakfast Club, I knew Joe would be enthusiastic about this film. And like he said, this is an underrated masterpiece. We have all heard of films like Seven Samurai, Rashomon, Yojimbo, some of the greatest films by Akira Kurosawa that literally inspired a new generation of action and western films. But little do people know about his ability to capture humanity in its most purest form. Ikiru may be the most famous exception, but I feel Red Beard is still not talked about enough. And what is a better way than to talk about one film people seldom talk of? To summarize Red Beard, it's set in 16th century Japan where a young, ambitious doctor, Yasumoto, is fresh from his training. He has relatives in high places including a father who is also a doctor, and he has got his sights set on becoming a personal physician to a shogun, a very high level position. He's like a fast-track doctor by today's standards. Only the film begins with him being posted to a public clinic run by the stern and relentless Dr. Nide, also called Red Beard. Yasumoto is greeted by a doctor whose position he is about to replace. Right from the opening, nothing looks bright for the young, ambitious Yasumoto, as his predecessor casually complains incessantly of the clinic.
It's not a prestigious post. It means caring for those who suffer poverty. It means very little money. It means staff heating their quarters as little as they can, specifically to save firewood for the patients who need it. It means staff quarters being at the damp north side of the clinic where the patient side gets the sun. Yasumoto is arrogant, he's ambitious. This is not what he trained as a doctor for. Tsugawa, Yasumoto's predecessor, who is now free to leave the clinic with Yasumoto's appointment, is very quick and very eager to make it clear to Yasumoto just how difficult life in the clinic really is. And the plot of this film is arguably very straightforward. Through his experience of working at the clinic, Yasumoto goes from someone very self-centered and ambitious who kind of sulks like a petulant child about being posted to the clinic and deliberately rebels in the hopes he'll get sent away. To become not just a good doctor, as in now matching all the theory he had from his training with the actual experience he gets here, but he also becomes someone quite compassionate, selfless, hardworking, and someone who understands people. He finishes the film as a very good doctor, a very good man, and someone who finally feels sure about what he really wants to do with his life. Where this film comes alive, however, is through the experiences we and Yasumoto are given of the other patients at the clinic. There's something slightly Dickens about the way Kurosawa weaves all these different stories from different characters through this one single location of the clinic to A, create the feel of a living, breathing community, but B, to give us all these different stories that all provide something poignant in a way that isn't forced or out of place. And often, these are experiences that come without need of dialogue, such as the patient Rokosuke, an old man slowly dying in his bed who they are unable to cure. Redbeard entrusts Yasumoto to watch over him, and we are given a long, agonising scene that focuses on Yasumoto's face as he stares down at Rokosuke, knowing this man is dying, knowing this man can't be helped, and feeling the terror of facing up to death like this for the first time, but also the guilt at the fact people like Rokosuke aren't people Yasumoto has had any interest in treating.
Interestingly, this whole sequence is a long, unbroken take. Throughout Kurosawa's career, you would see the master never investing heavily in long takes. It's not his usual trademark, but Red Beard is an exception. Almost all the patients that we meet later in the film are given this beautiful, unbroken treatment, as if it is simulating the very act of a doctor patiently healing a patient by simply listening to them. And this is what Yasumoto has to learn to become a great doctor. Patience. And this patience is carefully translated in the way Kurosawa makes his actors move and act in a single, unbroken moment. Without the need for film editing, you feel like you're there, in the moment, in real time, and this helps the audience relate powerfully to Yasumoto as he grows from the experiences. Coming back to the earlier naive version of Yasumoto at the beginning of the film, the arrogance of his desire to simply pick and choose the patients that will earn him riches and advance his career is laid bare for himself to see here, and in its unbroken form, it's uncomfortable.
And those of you who watched my Good Will Hunting video might notice a link there with the idea of arrogantly picking and choosing who you want to work with based on who will help your career. It's selfishness in a job that's meant to be as selfless as possible, but we know it does happen. Particularly with doctors, actually, who are shown great praise and admiration in society. Rightly so, because they save lives, but that does mean you can get very esteemed doctors who are needed by the hospitals because they're the only real specialist in a certain area, and who will then swan about doing largely whatever they want until an interesting case where they can swoop in, save the day, and revel in being lauded as a hero. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but that sort of thing can happen. Some people do go into careers like counselling or medicine or whatever else, not because they want to help people so much as they want to be praised for helping people. Which doesn't necessarily make them bad doctors or anything, obviously, but it means they can be too focused on that praise. Anyway, Red Beard is a wonderful film that, as you get further and further into it, becomes increasingly, surprisingly sweet and wholesome in ways I never expected it to be, to the point where you just come away smiling to yourself in the end. In many ways, that's the artistry of this film. You see all the ugliness of death, sickness, poverty, tragedy, abuse, lost love, shame, and yet out of this comes this heartening sweetness that I think is best seen through the experience of the character Otoyo in the film, which is what I wanted to focus this video on, discussing the character Otoyo and what her treatment here at the clinic can teach us. So we first meet Otoyo about 2/3 of the way into the film, where Yasumoto and Redbeard stop by a brothel to treat a patient with syphilis. Otoyo is a 12-year-old girl whose parents died, and so she was taken in by the madam of the brothel where, in return for the home and food, she's expected to become a prostitute. Her introduction comes with the chilling sound of her being beaten next door by the madam for essentially resisting. Otoyo is called ungrateful and spiteful, both by the madam and the other prostitutes. Our first sight of her is as a faceless silhouette, looked at through the door as though an animal in a cage.
Kurosawa once again leverages the use of filmmaking, this time exploiting the black and white cinematography. For many people, this medium is a turn-off, dismissing black and white as boring, outdated. But black and white has numerous advantages over color, most prominently the contrast between the blacks and the whites. A lot of classic films have used it to their advantage, especially noir films. In the case of Red Beard, the dark hopelessness of the black is contrasted with the hopeful, pure white. Otoyo's literal introduction is in total darkness, with only her eyes illuminated with a sliver of light. This is a motif used frequently, like in another scene when onlookers are listening to a dying patient's final confession. His left side is completely in darkness. Right at the time of his death, we finally get to see this side from a different angle in brightness, signifying his eventual release from this turmoil of regret. For Otoyo, she is a literal living corpse. Her initial reactions with Yasumoto are all in darkness, even in a seemingly well-lit room. With the exception of her haunting eyes that speak volumes of her tortured soul. It's extremely rare to see such grand visuals in cinema where filmmaking visually translates a character's emotions to the audience. Kurosawa did this more than 50 years ago, and it's still rare to see filmmaking of such memorable caliber.
Coming back to the brothel, we see only the white shine of her innocent eyes and her thin frame shaking in terror before she then lurches forwards, clearly traumatized, and begins obsessively scrubbing the floor, which, we're told, is what she always does. It's heart-wrenching. And uncomfortable to hear how casual the madam is about all of this. They realise Otoyo also has a fever and they take her away to the clinic against the madam's wishes to the extent she tries to stop them with guards, but they take her into care and Redbeard charges Yasumoto with tending to her personally. And I think the best way to do this is just to go through the story here chronologically and then veer off at moments where we have things to say. So, the most striking thing from the off is that she doesn't speak for a long time. We see her now in the clinic, waking with a sudden gasp and springing forwards to a position where, again, only her eyes are visible in the light, where the rest of her body is obscured in darkness, reaffirming this split between someone who is just an innocent child and someone who has suffered horrible physical abuse. But she doesn't speak to Yasumoto, she just watches him. And she turns his hand away when he tries to feel her forehead for a temperature, and she turns her head away when he tries to offer her water, and refuses all help to the point where we get a long shot of him sitting there, looking confused, trying to figure out what he's even supposed to do. Which I think is one of the great dilemmas with these sorts of jobs, and a lesson Yasumoto quickly learns here. Not everyone who needs help wants it, or is able to accept it. With Otoyo here, it's entirely unsurprising she doesn't want to help because one minute she's being beaten into submission by a brothel owner who wants her to become a prostitute, the next she's been technically kidnapped by two men and taken away to a strange new place. In her situation, you're not likely to trust them, no matter how much they tell you they're doctors and that they're here to help. She's very vulnerable. Never are we more vulnerable and helpless than when we need the treatment of doctors, when we're too weak to even stand up and just have to lie there letting them tend to us. In some cases, that total helplessness at the hands of another can feel comforting because it takes responsibility out of your hands, but in other cases it's terrifying, such as here. We can understand perfectly why Otoyo does not want to feel vulnerable, and when she can't muster the strength to do much else, her only show of strength, of resistance, of rebellion, even just expression itself. The only thing she can do is refuse help and care. That sort of uneasiness and resistance is part and parcel of a job like mine as a counsellor. It's something you patiently work with, but for doctors, it's much more tricky. One, because the doctor's job is more practical. They have lots of patients, they have to give medicine or whatever else, and they have to get on and do it. And two, there's lots of circumstances where if patients don't let you help them, they will die. There's an urgency to the job that can make resistance scary to the doctor, but also frustrating, maddening. Doctors can be pushed into positions where they'd want to rip their hair out and scream, "Are you stupid? If you don't let us help you, you will die." And down that route, you'd probably find Yasumoto shouting at Otoyo as ungrateful and spiteful in all the ways the madam shouted at Otoyo. And that would just feed into the cycle and give her more reason to resist, because suddenly these nice doctors are no better than the madam, and they aren't here to help but to punish her in just the same ways again. The cycle would repeat. I also wanted to draw attention to this maddening feel of patients resisting the doctor's help, because there was an article I remember reading in my training called The Ailment by Thomas Main, which talked about the fact selfless doctors and counsellors and whatever else are never wholly selfless. It's impossible to be 100% selfless, and there's always some small unconscious side of us that wants to help people because healing others feels like a symbolic version of healing ourselves. We get our own sense of reparation through the way we are able to repair others, essentially. And that is hopefully not too big a motivation, but it's foolish to pretend it doesn't exist, and Thomas Main's paper sets out what can happen when patients don't get better the way doctors hope they will. When treatment goes on for ages without them recovering, or sometimes even getting worse. In such instances, their lack of getting better can start to feel an obstacle or an attack against the doctor's personal desire for this symbolic healing, and it can start to feel like they're denying the doctor that feeling of, yes, I healed someone. And if that feeling becomes extreme, you can start to resent the patient for not getting better, as though they're deliberately not getting better to spite you. And that resentment can lead you down a route of unconsciously attacking them in return, maybe putting them through treatments that are painful or becoming more distant rather than nurturing. Or Main uses the example from his own study that nurses can end up sedating patients a lot more in this scenario as a kind of unconscious retaliation. It ultimately became clear to me and to them that no matter what the rationale was, a nurse would give a sedative only at the moment when she had reached the limit of her human resources and was no longer able to stand the patient's problems without anxiety, impatience, guilt, anger or despair. A sedative would now alter the situation and produce for her a patient who, if not dead, was at least quiet and inclined to lie down, and who would cease to worry her for the time being. And then, after given space to reflect on their feelings, they continued to have permission to give sedatives on their own initiative, but they became more sincere in tolerating their own feelings and in handling the patients, and use of sedatives slowly dropped to zero. That sort of thing could possibly have happened here if Yasumoto hadn't improved as a doctor at this point in the film. Not sedatives, but some unconscious retaliation. As it is though, he's quite patient with Otoyo's resistance. She continues on with this distant numbness towards him, and when her strength returns, she starts scrubbing the floors again until she feels sick once more and collapses into bedridden fever again. And there is this cycle repeated that would be frustrating for Yasumoto. You can empathise with why it'd be frustrating to see her scrubbing the floors, knowing it will make her sick, being unable to stop her unless you were to physically restrain her, which probably isn't the ideal route to take with someone who has suffered physical abuse. Yasumoto has to be patient and understanding. Nonetheless, it's difficult, and we get this interesting moment where he tries to give her the medicine and she slaps it away. Red Beard comes in now and tries to give her the medicine.
薬を与えようとすると跳ね抜けるんです。どれ、わしがやってみよう。
She slaps it away again, but take note of how terrified she instantly looks, as though expecting him to hit her in retaliation. Her eyes are fixed on him all the time, as though waiting for it. He doesn't retaliate, however. He gently pours out more medicine, which she slaps away again, and now even lets out an ambivalent cry of mocking, perhaps triumph at her rebellion, all mixed with the terror that becomes more prominent with her next stifled gasps. I think the ambivalence there is important for understanding her feelings, the triumphant joy and superior freedom of being able to rebel against someone else, to not be helpless and to instead make them feel useless. There was probably a part of her that enjoyed angering the madam for similar reasons, yet also then the terror of the retaliation that follows. He wipes it from his beard and tries again. She's watching him intently, confused by him, terrified he'll get angry and yet unable to stop herself slapping the medicine away, but he keeps offering medicine and then, eventually, she relents before fearfully cowering away under the covers. Patience and understanding are always important, particularly with those who seem resistant to your help. You can't just expect them to trust you. You can't just tell them to trust you. You have to demonstrate you are worthy of their trust.
なぜ撃たなかったの？
え？
あの人はなぜ私を撃たなかったの？
A scene follows in which Otoyo finally speaks and explains she is confused because Redbeard didn't hit her. Yasumoto explains again they're here to help, but she still doesn't believe it.
先生はね、ただお前を治したいんだ。体もそうだな。お前のそのいじめつけられて片になった心を治したいんだよ。
あなたも？
もちろん私だって。さあ。
これでも？
The thing I want to jump to now, however, is the idea of kindness. This bowl that Otoyo breaks here, she later runs away from the clinic and begs in the street with the plan to discreetly buy and replace that bowl with a new one. She wanted to do something kind, but not for Yasumoto to notice it, because being spotlighted for our kindness can be scary in its own way. The fact we're clearly seen to care can add to the sense of vulnerability, and it can make our guilt feel all too real, whereas if nobody knows you care, then the guilt isn't as evident, it's something you can ignore a bit easier, and therefore the uncomfortable feeling of guilt is less overwhelming. When Yasumoto finds her, she hangs her head and limply walks away from him, but nonetheless, it's an act of kindness from someone who's been told she is nothing but spiteful and ungrateful. An act of kindness from someone who was beaten for supposedly being a horrible girl. Something I think is often underrated in counselling is the importance of giving clients the opportunity to show kindness and then acknowledging when they do show it, even if it is very small things and even if it's then followed up by something much less kind afterwards, and even if you only acknowledge it very subtly so that it doesn't feel like spotlighting. For example, imagine a scenario with, say, a 12-year-old girl like Otoyo in a therapy session who snaps paintbrushes in half or throws one of the toys at the wall and breaks it. She might not feel able to apologise for that, nor even to recognise any feelings of guilt, but she might, maybe a bit later on, suddenly paint a picture of, say, a sun in the sky that she wants you to have and she gives it to you like a present. It's just a painting, but it is a small act of kindness that is worth acknowledging. In part, I suppose it's a way of saying, I'm not always bad, I can be good. And it's probably a way of trying to tell herself that too. You can be good, Otoyo, you don't always have to feel horrible. And it is only a small act that could easily slip by without comment, but it's worth responding to and reaffirming that message. you're showing kindness in this moment. And it's important I say all that in terms of where this film then goes, because Yasumoto basically gets sick himself from the stress of how desperately hard he's been working.
私はなってませんね。何もかも。自分一人だけいい子になって。
It's also interesting to note that before Red Beard finds out Yasumoto is sick from all the hard work, we get yet another brief, unbroken scene wherein Yasumoto confesses his anguish and shame to Red Beard. This is one of the turning points in the story where the doctor becomes the patient, and like a counselor, Red Beard silently lets Yasumoto vent out his feelings. This scene is literally synonymous to the one almost an hour ago, where a woman whose father just recently passed away in the clinic shares her own distress to Red Beard. In that very scene with the woman, Red Beard even signals Yasumoto to be silent even after Yasumoto passes news that needs Red Beard's urgent presence. It is very moving to see Kurosawa treating his characters, including the doctors themselves, as imperfect humans. Humans who make mistakes, who get diseased, angry, frustrated, who get ashamed. This is the part where Yasumoto is completely broken. Not just physically, but also mentally after witnessing the harsh reality of the world. An ambitious doctor looking forward to a prestigious position that will serve the privileged, now learning how oblivious he is to the true suffering of the non-privileged.
安本、お前は疲れすぎたんだ。いいよ。なんだよ、なんだよ。
He comes down with a fever, and in a half-delirious state, we see Otoyo now tending him the way he had previously been tending to her.
And I think this is where the film really starts to become sweet, because it just feels so heartening to see Otoyo like this, comparing it to how she was before. Part of why she feels able to do this is because Yasumoto is delirious and doesn't really know what's happening at first, so like with secretly replacing the bowl, she feels she can show kindness without it being spotlighted at all, and we see Yasumoto at various points pretending to be asleep, but the more she tends to him, the more comfortable she becomes with doing it, and the more she will get out of seeing him getting better and having that very real feeling, I did something really good there. It's a very common thing, for example, that counsellors have a doctor's kit in their rooms when they work with kids, because it gives kids the opportunity to play at being a doctor if they want to. A bit like Otoyo is here, pretending often that the counsellor is a sick patient and that they heal you, because it's that same symbolic idea. I am repairing something. I don't always break things and make everything worse. I can repair things too. I can be kind. I can create rather than destroy. And it is only a game in a session, so this imaginary play of being a doctor doesn't feel too overwhelming for kids who aren't used to showing kindness, but it provides a very good opportunity to symbolically see what it would feel like to repair something. I mean, we know repairing things is a very good experience, even if Thomas Maine points out how it can become unhealthy when the repairs get tricky. We know, though, that making art gives us that feeling of, I created something beautiful. We know, for example, there's a hell of a lot of evidence behind how positive and therapeutic gardening can be, because it's this same symbolic experience of helping things grow. For people who unconsciously feel deep down they just destroy everything and make the world a worse place and that nobody could possibly love them, seeing very clearly how they have made something grow can be incredibly beneficial. And Redbeard understands the importance of this in his clinic. It's part of why he wants the clinic to have this community feel rather than just keeping people in bed, treating them physically and then moving them on. He wants an environment where people feel like they are provided opportunities to do good things. He's happy to let Otoyo tend to Yasumoto rather than another doctor because, as he explains, tending to him will also help her, and he's right, it does.
でもそれは巨城先生に言われてしただけよ。先生はね、あなたを看病するのが私の病気にも一番いいんだって。
Otoyo gets to learn that the madam was wrong, that she isn't just a spiteful, ungrateful girl, she can be much more than that. Once she is physically better, rather than sending her away to live with the madam again, which would obviously be a horrible thing to do, she kind of just becomes part of the community. One of the workers who help with all the laundry and washing, and again, gets this opportunity to show herself how kind she can be, and more than that, gets given a place to belong. I think Otoyo's change is the turning point in this film where it does gradually shift from something quite dark and sombre to something incredibly sweet, with the life-affirming message that love and kindness do spread, even in a world of great pain. We encounter a 7-year-old boy called Chobo who regularly sneaks into the clinic and steals their gruel when he's hungry. All the workers know of him and call him a rat for what he does, but he's so quick and sneaky that they've never quite been able to catch him. Well, Otoyo spots him and effectively turns a blind eye to what he's doing. He's able to walk right in and take the gruel from beside her, which the other staff spot happening and are now furious with Otoyo about. Why is she letting the rat thief get away with it? After all the kindness we've shown to take her in, this is how she repays us? How can she sanction thievery? But we then get possibly the most charming scene in the film, where Chobo encounters Otoyo again with Yasumoto and another worker secretly watching on. Chobo's bought Otoyo some candy he stole as a word of thanks for her not turning him in. She refuses the candy at first because he stole it, but they talk as two innocent kids talking, and the sincere childishness in their interaction is just so charming. Chobo talks about how he and his other siblings regularly go hungry, and Otoyo tells him she thinks it's better to beg than to steal, but they connect, and she does then accept his gift of candy, his act of kindness, only she then offers the candy back to him as a gift in return to Chobo, telling him to share it with his siblings, and telling him also not to steal again, but that if he comes at night, she will give him food for free. It's just so sweet to see how she's grown from her experience at the clinic and how she wants to then help someone else in turn. The worker watching on breaks down in tears with guilt over how she scolded Otoyo as ungrateful when really she's showing a level of kindness and compassion to Chobo that they themselves have not shown. It's from here that Otoyo really becomes an accepted member of the community. Kindness does spread when it's given space and time and opportunity to reveal itself. I think that's the simple yet incredibly heartfelt message behind a lot of this film. We see Yasumoto at first self-centered and petty and showing all this resistance, yet Red Beard is patient with him and provides him with opportunities to grow and change as a doctor, from someone who had all the theory but not much else into someone who understands people and connects with his patients. We see this same kindness then spread into Otoyo from Yasumoto and then into Chobo, and obviously with various other patients I haven't mentioned here. I think it's also a lesson in how big a difference one man can make if, like Red Beard, they work tirelessly at it.
Red Beard is a character who doesn't even get over an hour of screen time in the 3-hour runtime, and yet the film is named after him because his ideologies are the one taking center stage. And I think making a video essay not only lets us go over the film's ideologies in depth, but also lets us add another video essay into the YouTube space in order to spread the unknown and undiscovered beauty of this film.
A special thank you goes to Devin, David Kling, Darren Burdock-Latter, Kestrel, Kay Hitler, Incomplete Sentient, Samara Salsi, Sharikoff2814 and Joshua C. Follier.